Notebook on Cities and Culture's Korea Tour is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, David Hayes, and Polar Inertia Journal, an outlet for artists and researchers documenting the urban condition at polarinertia.com. It's one of those things that didn't come that clear to me until I came to South Korea, that Korean friends would say in the States that, why are you Americans so afraid of North Korea? They'd sort of make fun of us, wondering why do you care so much about the North? They're just some other Koreans on the other side. And I get here and I realize, yeah, they really don't care about North Korea, do they?
Well, it's like what they say about the Sword of Damocles. If you've got a sword hanging over your head, after a while you just learn to live with it and you act as if it's not there. And these people have been living with this threat of North Korea their entire lives. They've grown up with it. And yet it hasn't really affected or threatened people that much, especially not down here in Busan, where I am. And the nuclear threat has made North Korea more dangerous to the United States, but it hasn't made the country any more dangerous to the South Koreans themselves, whose cities could just as easily be obliterated with the conventional weapons that the North Koreans have had for decades already. So after a while, you learn to understand it. Still, I do think they're being a little bit too complacent, and I don't really understand how it is that the attack on Yeonpyeong Island, for example, was dismissed by many South Koreans as being something very far away, when any Japanese claims to Tokdo Island, yes, which geographically speaking is much further away, are taken very seriously indeed.
It is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting here in one of these South Korean cities, Busan, with Brian Reynolds Myers. He is a North Korea analyst and someone I spoke to last about 4 years ago on this show's predecessor, shall we say, The Marketplace of Ideas, about his book, The Cleanest Race, a book about North Korean propaganda, their view of themselves, and the difference between what North Korea tells the outside world and what it tells its own people. Now, I don't want to talk about North Korea this whole time because I'm sure you get enough North Korea-related questions, but tell me, I get a sense of the Korean idea of what's close and what's far. I mean, North Korea is close, but they're not afraid of it. We're here in Busan, it seems to be regarded as fairly far from Seoul. And I mean, in what way is it thought of as far from Seoul?
South Korea is a very capital-centric country, I think much more so even than, say, France or England. You have to imagine that Congress and Wall Street and Hollywood and Disneyland and Silicon Valley and Harvard, Yale, and Princeton and all of these things are concentrated in one American city. And then you get kind of an idea what it's like for the cities in South Korea that are not Seoul. So they're not far away. We're not that far away in geographical terms. And the bullet train makes Seoul closer and closer, temporally speaking. I mean, in 2 or 3 years, it'll only take 2 hours to go from Busan.
Oh, is it going down? It seemed fast. I just took it here, and it was like, wow, that was easy.
It's fast enough as it is, but they're developing trains apparently that can lean into curves, and that apparently is going to cut the time even further down to about 2 hours. But I think in status terms and in cultural terms, that hasn't diminished the distance that is perceived between Seoul and Busan.
Because it was interesting to me. I would talk to Korean friends in America, and if they would come from Seoul, that'd be one thing. But if they'd come from Busan or Daegu or Gwangju, I'd ask them what their city was like, and they're very dismissive. Oh, that's a village, essentially. That's not Seoul. Just that it wasn't Seoul was enough to write it off entirely.
Exactly, yeah. When you ask somebody, a Korean, where he's from, and they're not from Seoul, the answer is often Chibang, which literally means region, but in practice means not Seoul. And that for them says everything. I'm not from Seoul. And of course, they're flattered if you say, oh, I've been to your hometown and I like it. I like it for these reasons. They're flattered. But they themselves do not feel any kind of local patriotism or regional patriotism.
There's no Daegu pride.
There really isn't. There's nothing even like Osaka pride in Japan or Beijing pride or Shanghai pride in China. They just don't have that. It always reminds me of the famous New Yorker cartoon of, the United States or the world as perceived from the New Yorker's perspective. Only the difference is that the Chibang people, the non-Seoul people, perceive their own environment just as dismissively as the Seoul people do, which is a real shame. And I think it works against a sense of community. You don't really have a community here in Busan. You've got an aggregation of apartment buildings, and in every apartment is somebody dreaming of getting to Seoul.
That's the one thing. It's like, you need that before you can have anything else. You need to be in Seoul before any other goal can be achieved.
Yeah, that's true. And if you haven't made it to Seoul, and I experience this as well, I think everybody who works in Busan experiences this to a certain extent. There is among people, not just in Seoul, but even in people in Busan, the feeling that you haven't really succeeded in life. And what have you done? What mistake have you made that you're working in Busan and not in Seoul?
Exile, huh?
Yeah, and that, of course, is historically what it was. And if you were successful, there's that great book by Gregory Henderson about Korea as a vortex that has always sucked successful people into Seoul. And the people who couldn't get there were always frustrated.
How does it work then with people who leave Korea entirely, the ones who go over to America? I mean, is America its own vortex for Koreans, like the way Seoul is?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, less so than it used to be. It's kind of fluctuated in the past. I mean, up until, I would say, the 1990s, living in America was perceived a higher form of success than being successful in Korea. And then in the early 1990s, South Korea was doing so well economically that people even began looking down on Korean Americans. And then the IMF hit, and then to be a Korean American was something extra. And now I think it's kind of balanced out a bit. And I think certainly if you're living in Gangnam in the right neighborhoods, then you are perceived as being at the top of the status pyramid.
Last time we talked, you mentioned doing some research in Germany. You mentioned your high school years in South Africa. You've lived many a place. Tell me, what is distinctive about South Korea as a place to live in for you?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. It's really hard for me to speak about it objectively because I've never lived anywhere, in any country as long as I've lived in South Korea. And I've never lived in any city as long as I've lived in Busan, for that matter. And it just feels like home. I really can't talk about it any more analytically than that. I suppose the attraction of it really is that I'm perceived as being an outsider no matter how long I live here. And I enjoy the benefits of that. I enjoy the benefits of outsider status, of not being expected to do what everybody else is doing.
Of which there are many expectations.
If for a Korean here, your whole life is a matter of making various groups happy. And the fact that I'm not expected to take part in that, I really enjoy. When living in Germany or South Africa, the United States, I was constantly aware of being strange or introverted, or of being not participating enough in group or community life. And the fact that it's not expected of me here as a foreigner, I really enjoy.
It reminds me of reading about the sort of generation of Japanologists that stayed in Japan after the Second World War, and they had their own eccentricities, but it didn't matter because they were foreigners. And is it, would you describe it as a feeling of freedom? I can see another foreigner here thinking of that as somewhat oppressive, to feel like you're always outside, but do you have to find a way to use that well, or is it just automatically like, oh, that's a weight off of me, that I don't have to be in the society the way Koreans do?
I think it depends what kind of a personality you have. I mean, I do get the impression that the extroverted foreigners who are used to community life in their own countries chafe at their outsider status here in South Korea. I enjoy it, and what I especially like as an academic is the intellectual freedom that you have. If you are a foreigner in South Korea, you have a degree of intellectual freedom which is much higher than you get as an American in the United States. My impression of the academic discourse in America is that you can hardly turn around without knocking into some kind of taboo.
Yes.
There are enormous fields of life that you're just not allowed to talk about. And I think we all know what they are. Whereas in South Korea, I can even impinge against the nationalism or the nationalist taboos with impunity. I mean, I can actually tell South Koreans that my impression of the colonial period is a very different one from the one that they have.
What do you say to them about it?
Well, I ask them to review their assumption that colonial Korea was divided into a tiny minority of pro-Japanese collaborators and a mass of Japan-hating Korean patriots. And I find a lot of people accepting that almost with a kind of relief or eagerness, as if they've been waiting for an opportunity to talk about these things. And a South Korean, cannot do this without being accused of chinil. In other words, without being accused of being pro-Japanese in a disreputable way. So that's something that I really enjoy. I can also say positive things about North Korea without being called a balgengi or a red, and I can say positive things about Park Chung-hee without being dismissed as a golsu or a blockheaded conservative. So I really enjoy that, and when I find myself back in America at an academic conference or something, I just find the atmosphere so much more stifling in comparison.
Koreans will engage you in real conversations about whether it's North Korea, whether it's Park Chung-hee, whether it's the colonial period. They'll actually then continue the conversation with you. They won't just sort of turn away.
Well, you have to take into account that the Korean people are generally not particularly interested in history. They're what I would consider ahistoric people. I always refer to Spengler's Decline of the West because there's a really good part in that book where he contrasts the attitude to history that the ancient Greeks had to the attitude that the ancient Egyptians had. The Egyptians perceived themselves as being a point on a time continuum that stretched infinitely long in both directions, towards the past and the future. And the Greeks, in contrast, were completely living in the present. Now, that did not preclude the mythologization of a very recent past, which you find in all ahistoric societies, apparently. But the Greeks were living in the present, and they were building with wood, and they were not giving much thought to what was going to happen 100 years from them, or what had happened 100 years before. Even the very recent past had already had sort of coalesced into myth, and they weren't completely sure what had happened.
Away.
Yeah. And Spengler talks about a contract signed between two Greeks. And on the contract, they said this contract will be valid for 100 years. And they didn't even bother to date it. They didn't put a date on the contract. And I see so much in there that reminds me of Korea and the determination or the way in which they view all old things as being eo ipso substandard, almost disreputable or disgraceful.
You should see when I bring up albums from the 70s and 80s made in Korea. No, they don't want to hear about those.
Exactly. We look at these pictures. I love looking at black and white pictures of Seoul in the 70s or 60s or 50s. And when I show them on slides to my students, it's as if I've broken some kind of trust and that
Aghast.
I really shouldn't have done that. And you go to North Korea and you're telling your minder and your driver to stop because you've seen a thatched roof house, and they don't want to know. They want to keep on driving.
So they can replace those all up in the north.
They're getting around to it. If they've left them, it's not because they want to preserve them. It's because they haven't got the money to tear them down. Right. And the most absurd example really is Kim Il-sung's birth house in Pyongyang, which is the only thatched roof home that they want you to see. And it still kept looking brand new because any sign of age is considered disgraceful and unclean. And this, of course, runs counter to the big label that everybody likes to stick on Korea, which is Confucian. The attitude to time and history is about as un-Confucian as it could possibly be.
How did it get that way?
I don't know. It certainly wasn't like that in the Chosun dynasty. In other words, in the pre-modern times. But it's been this way for as long as I can remember. Look at Busan, we're one of the two cities that wasn't completely destroyed in the Korean War, and yet you'll be very hard-pressed to find a building here that's over, say, 30 or 40 years old.
It reminds me of when I talk to Korean friends, they'll be able to tell me more about ancient Korean history, than Americans will be able to say about even the founding of America. But a song that is 3 years old, a movie that's 2 years old, a drama that's 1 year old is old. 1 year old is old. There's that. It gives me a bit of cognitive dissonance, but it doesn't seem to bother them.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I noticed that with movies in the United States. If you're a movie buff, then, you've seen Taxi Driver, you've seen The Godfather, you've seen even, black and white movies. And yet for the South Koreans, the idea of sitting and watching a black and white movie, you've got to be an ultra hardcore cineast to have seen anything that's more than, say, 10 years old. But their knowledge of ancient history is, I think, very superficial, and it's not ordered in a sequence. If you ask them to, not just to give me the story of Admiral Lee Sun-shin, but to give me sort of a narrative of Korean history, no matter how bold brushstroke it might be, they have difficulty doing that, and their knowledge of history is mixed up with the serial dramas and things that they've seen, which take enormous liberties.
I also think it seemed to me to be a contrast that people of my parents' generation, people in their 60s in America, will very often listen to songs from the 1960s, 1970s, 1950s, sometimes only those. They'll listen to exclusively songs from 1970s, say. But a middle-aged Korean doesn't seem to do that. They may have fond memories of a song themselves, but they won't necessarily pull one out of the archives and keep it at the top of their own rotation. I thought that was because for a Korean, there's no argument they could make to themselves that 1970 was a better time than today. But maybe that's not true. I don't know. Does that sound plausible to you?
I would say the music is the one place where they do keep that past.
In Korea, because now I'm just talking about Koreans who came to America.
That could be, yeah. I mean, they tend to lose touch with everything that was popular after they left. I find that. But generally speaking, I mean, I listen to a lot of South Korean radio, and I keep hearing these chestnuts from the 70s and 80s, and there seems to be a general consensus, even among young people, that the songs then were better, that they had more to say.
Oh, really?
What I don't hear is the songs of the 90s or the hits of the early 2000s.
When the economy really went into overdrive.
Yeah, well, those songs, I think they just tend to be dismissed or cast aside much more than the songs of the 70s and 80s. Yeah, and they've got these 7080 nightclubs, in other words, 7080 nightclubs, where you have live performers going through the stuff in the 70s and the 80s. And I find my students, as ignorant as they may be of say, Korean literature or Korean movie history, they know all those songs as well.
What do you find your students do want to talk about, especially with a foreign professor like yourself?
I think they're genuinely interested they're primarily interested in how the foreigner perceives Korea. They're not, and they are curious about countries that they perceive as being more successful than South Korea in economic terms. This is something that frustrates me because we're trying to make the students realize just how important China and India and Russia and Brazil, how important these countries are going to be to their own futures. And I'm constantly telling them to learn Indonesian, which I think is the golden tip, because Indonesian is a very easy language to learn.
And about 6 months and you can converse.
Exactly. They don't have a particularly developed past tense, from what I hear, and they don't make a big fuss about plurals and so on, which is right up the Koreans' alley, you would think. And yet they all are learning English and Chinese in the hope that that's going to distinguish them on the job market. So they are interested in the outside world, but they look at the outside world in terms of an economic hierarchy. And I notice if I have an exchange student from the United States who gets up and talks about his hometown, they're all ears. No
matter where that hometown is, it could be the lower than Busan, far lower on the scale of everything.
It's still the United States, or right, or if it was Western Europe, that's still okay. And yet, when a Russian stands up and talks, or an Egyptian or a Kyrgyz student, I can tell that the attention level drops markedly, which is unfortunate and short-sighted.
Now, we've talked a bit this time about South Korean culture, the songs, the films, the dramas. Last time you talked about all the North Korean culture you absorbed to write the book, The Cleanest Race, and what that culture revealed about the messages getting sent to North Koreans themselves and how that diverges from the messages English-speaking foreigners hear. So is there a difference existing in the Korean language world? Do you perceive a difference with what the Koreans hear about themselves and what they tell the world?
Yeah, I think so. There's always been more xenophobia, of course, in domestic, esoteric or Korean-oriented Korean popular culture. Just to give the example of a few years ago, when Psy was being such a hit around the world with Gangnam Style, the news came out that Psy had sung a very anti-American song and I think destroyed an American tank, a model of an American tank in a performance in front of South Koreans. And the South Korean reaction was not, was not to reflect critically on what Psy had done. The first question was, who told them? How did they find out?
Who told them?
Yeah, who was it? Which Korean-speaking foreigner or which Korean was disloyal enough to us and destructive enough to let the rest of the world know about this? And that is a reminder that there used to be, to a much greater extent, two very different cultures. You would get under Park Chung-hee a very anti-American culture, and the American GI was portrayed in South Korean serial dramas and in movies as a villain, as a rapist. And yet you had a very fulsome pro-American formal discourse in which Korean leaders would tell the Americans how grateful Koreans are for America's help in the Korean War and so on. But that gap seems to be diminishing a lot. It's certainly nowhere near as big as the gap that you find in North Korea between domestic only and external oriented propaganda.
How much of a Korean life do you have to be leading before you can perceive this stuff clearly?
Well, you've got to learn the Korean language. And one of the things that distinguishes the expatriate community here from the expatriate community in Japan and China, even now, is that the percentage of foreigners who learn the Korean language is much lower.
I was going to ask that because I've been studying it myself for a while in America. I have friends come back from 2 years, 3 years, 4 years in Korea. Did you learn any of the language? Often, no, which astonishes me.
Yeah, I don't know where it comes from, because if you go to Beijing, I think I'm correct in saying that the average long-term expatriate living in China speaks pretty good Chinese, certainly good by my standards. And in Japan as well, I've heard a lot of Japanese expatriates in Japan speaking Japanese to a higher degree of fluency even than the foreigners here in South Korea, who are so famous for their Korean skills that they're on TV every week.
It doesn't take much to get on TV every week for that?
Well, it takes good Korean skills, don't get me wrong. It takes very good Korean skills. But if you spoke Japanese at that level, you would not get the Japanese making such a fuss over you. And whether that's the reason for it or not, I don't know. The Koreans do not demand Korean language skills. I mean, I've often had Koreans apologize to me for not being able to speak English for the level of their English, and I always have to say, I'm the one in Korea.
Right,
you know, I'm the one who should be apologizing.
It's logical to me.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I've tried to think of what is it all about. Koreans not having much of an expectation that someone will learn? Is that why people just sort of skate by without the language for however long they're here?
That could be it. I think part of the problem is also that people do not come here with the intention of living here for a long time. I think I'm correct again in saying that that Korea is not a country that foreigners fall in love with to the extent that they fall in love with China or Japan. In those countries, you will meet China freaks and you will meet the Japan freak. The Korea freak is not so often encountered. So for whatever reasons. So you get foreigners who come here thinking they're going to stay for 1 year, and that becomes 2, becomes 3 years. And then after a while, they've been here 6 or 7 years, and they've just got this survival Korean.
Of course, there are Koreans in America who do that very thing. In Los Angeles, who live 30, 40 years without really picking up English. So it goes both ways. I don't know if there's any relationship there.
The difference is that those Koreans in Koreatown are Koreans who are interacting exclusively with people of their own language. And the foreigners, on the other hand, are interacting with Koreans. Many of them have Korean girlfriends or Korean boyfriends. They're teaching Koreans every day. So I don't know, but my Korean is not good enough for me to be saying these things in a critical tone. And my Korean is not where it should be after 10, 11 years in the country. You know.
Is there something about the language that's especially difficult? I mean, I guess I ask as somebody studying it as well, albeit with much less experience. Are there elements that Westerners just sort of beat their heads against with the Korean language that are not so difficult in other languages?
Yes, I think I'm not a linguist enough to be able to pin the proper terms onto it. All I know about Korean is that it's an agglutinative language, which means that...
I've heard that word too.
Yeah, I toss it around without really knowing what it means. I think it means that the cases and things are glued onto the words instead of actually changing the way that they would in, say, German or something. But the problem for me is the lack of a really developed grammar that I can rely on. The first foreign language I learned was German, and I just, one of the things I love about German is that it gives you a bunch of rules that you need a year to memorize, and then you follow that blueprint. You follow the instructions
without exception,
and pretty much without exception. I mean, there's exceptions in every language, but in Korea, you're constantly coming up against things that are a question of feeling, and my Korean teacher and I, we just come close to strangling each other every week. I still take Korean lessons because she cannot explain to me why something sounds funny. It just does. And I get the impression you really need to have heard every single sentence at some stage in order to generate a similar sentence in the future.
Right. You can say what you've heard, and that's it.
Exactly. And that is why speaking time and interaction in Korean is so important. You just cannot learn from a grammar book the way that you can with Chinese. And even Japanese, I think, is more, if I take, just for example, the difference in Japanese between wa and ga.
Oh, geez.
That is bad enough. And yet it's still easier to master than the difference between nun and i, nanun and nega in Korean, for example.
It is, yes. Last time we talked, we discussed, I mean, it's something that's brought up in your bios a lot, how you earned your degree in Soviet studies as soon as the wall collapsed. I mean, tell me a little bit more about that. Was it something, did you know that was coming and that was just sort of it was a months-long process of being aware that you would have to change tracks? Or was it really like, oh, whoops, this day came, you had to change to Korea?
Well, yeah, I mean, I certainly had no idea it was coming, and nobody did. This is why I always counsel Koreans to be very careful with their predictions of how slowly unification can be brought about. Nobody in Germany, when I got my MA, it was 89, early 89, February, and nobody, not a soul, thought that unification was going to come within the next 10 years. And then it came about. But by the time the wall came down, I had already realized that a degree in Soviet studies was not going to make me, make a bidding war erupt among, companies that wanted to hire me. So I already saw the writing on the wall. I think Soviet studies was already on the out and out pretty much as soon as Gorbachev came to power. People could see that whether or not Germany was going to reunify, the Cold War was waning. So, yeah.
Does the reunification of Germany have any lessons to teach South Korea about what might come with their own reunification, if and when?
It should teach the Koreans that unification is going to happen in accordance with how much the worse off party wants it. The West Germans didn't want unification as quickly as it came about, and they were dreaming of doing it in stages. But the East Germans just kept running over the border, and the unification was the only way to keep them put. And that's going to happen in South Korea as well. They need to learn that lesson. The other lesson they need to learn is that unification can be very beneficial. And this is the most infuriating thing that I encounter when I discuss unification, is the idea that Korea should not unify the way Germany did, because look at what a mess Germany has become. Now, I could see saying that maybe 15 years ago. But now, when it's the best functioning, when it's become the leader of Europe by a long chalk, it just becomes so obviously flimsy an excuse for the South Koreans' own reluctance to unify, which has less to do with fears of economic costs than with fears of social costs, I think, and with fears of competition for success becoming even more fierce and even more difficult.
Do you meet many Koreans who have read your writings on North Korea? Just people who, not that you're, scheduling a meeting with, but people you happen to meet who are aware of your analysis of the northern neighbor?
No, if I'm known for anything here in South Korea, ironically enough, it's for an editorial that I wrote after the sinking of the Cheonan, after the North Koreans sank a South Korean ship in 2010, March 2010. I wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times in which I dwelt on the inconsistency between South Koreans' responses to American or Japanese outrages and their response to actual attacks on their territory or on their forces by the North Koreans. And in that article, I drew attention to the lack of what I would call state spirit. 국가 정신, I would call it in Korean, although there's a Korean word, 국민성, which means citizenness in a sense. In other words, the South Koreans' lack of any sense of identification with their republic as an entity. And that made me very well known and very well liked in the arch conservative camp in South Korea. People tend to know that. My book has been translated into Korean and it's gone into a second edition, so it's obviously doing okay. And occasionally I'll meet people who read that. I was just invited to Yonsei University by a professor up there who had read the book. But, it's nothing like, no, it certainly is not well known here.
What was the process of actually converting to studying Korea when you found you had to do that post fall of the Berlin Wall? What was it a matter of doing at that point?
It was simply a matter of starting to read North Korean books. I was in Japan at that time, teaching German and English for the Berlitz schools. And, I thought, well, I can't take this for another few months or go crazy. I'll shoot myself.
What was wrong with it?
Well, I mean, I don't want to disparage language teaching, and I certainly don't want to disparage the Berlitz schools, but let's just say it wasn't an intellectually rewarding or particularly financial rewarding thing to do with my life. So I thought I've got to just start reading and researching North Korean literature and then start writing a thesis which will be accepted in Germany. I was always clear that I was going to have to get my PhD in Germany.
Why Germany?
Well, I got my MA in Germany. I was familiar with that system, and I didn't like the Western idea of actually going to classes in order to get a PhD. I've never understood the point of that. It always seems so regimented, which is the opposite of what a doctoral program should be. And I was living in Himeji in Japan, and which had a North Korean school there. In other words, a school for Korean Japanese who were loyal to Pyongyang. And so I just dropped by there and I asked if I could use their library. And it's funny because I was sitting under the poster of an American being bayoneted.
What did they make of an American coming by to just check it out?
They were not very mistrustful. I was scrupulous enough not to pass myself off as being pro-North Korean or sympathetic in any way. And I just said that I wanted to study the work of Lee Gi-young was the North Korean novelist that I expressed an interest in. And they took me to their bookshelves, which surprised me because they had not been filtered. After the North Korean Cultural Revolution of the mid-1960s, everything that had been written before then was withdrawn because it said nice things about the Red Army and made clear that the Red Army had liberated North Korea. And they still had all these old books there. So they just basically let me borrow them and start reading, and that's what I did.
When did you actually come to live in South Korea? You've been here how long?
I came here a week before 9/11. So I actually left. I mean, the issue of the Atlantic Monthly that had my Reader's Manifesto in it, which was sort of a controversial article. I think the literary controversy just before 9/11. Actually, the counterattacks were coming out even after 9/11.
Oh my!
Yeah. So I came here a week before 9/11. So I've been here now for 13 years.
What was the first stretch like of living here? Those first few years, or indeed few months. What took the most mental readjustment, I suppose?
I suppose the language really, because I had been speaking Korean at home with my wife, but not formal or polite Korean, and the humiliating experience often of saying the completely wrong thing to people older than me or to my bosses, that and actually having to lecture in Korean, because I would have to lecture for 6 hours a day in Korean about North Korea. And that just was an enormous adjustment for me to have to make. I mean, literally every free moment was spent writing the lectures, and I would need 9-10 hours to prepare for a 3-hour lecture in Korean.
Still a highly effective language learning method, I would think.
Yeah, it's trial by fire, all right. But I'm so grateful to the students, because my Korean now is still not good enough, I think, for me to lecture at anywhere near the level at which I can lecture in English. And they were extremely forgiving. And let's remember that was the high point of anti-Americanism in South Korea. That year, 2002, of the World Cup and the Hyosun Misun incident, in which an American armored vehicle ran over and killed 2 South Korean schoolgirls. That was the height of the flag burning anti-American demonstrations. And there in front of them, they have an American who has come to teach them about North-South Korean relations, or about North Korea. And if South Koreans were as xenophobic as their reputation, they would have made short work of me and probably refused to be taught by me. And yet they were nothing but welcoming and flattering and accommodating. And I'm still grateful to them for that.
We've talked a bit about South Korean perceptions of America, and this question might be a little bit abstract, but what do South Koreans seem to think America is?
They have a much more positive view of the country than I do, and one of the reasons they're a little bit mistrustful of Americans here in South Korea is because they can't understand why any American in his right mind who's not, escaping a jail term or something, why he would voluntarily come to Korea and want to live here, even if you're a Korea scholar, as I am. That they seem to find that strange, and they're not as put off by America's reputation for violent crime as we Americans ourselves are. For me, that's a huge drawback, that even in a small town in New Mexico, where I lived, that I couldn't go out at night and without looking over my shoulder. And here in South Korea, I can be out at 3 a.m. And without any fear at all. That for me is a big plus, but for the South Koreans, it isn't. It is the best thing for South Koreans is not to be part of American life, because that's not what they're dreaming of. They're dreaming of being a part of Korean American life.
Which to them looks like what?
It looks like living in Monterey Park in LA, say, having a huge car and a huge house, and your kids are able to grow up with less in terms of that examination pressure, and yet still be able to study their way into the best universities and get out and make lots of money. And so, in other words, the benefits of Korean life and that sense of belonging to a Korean community, combined with the relatively low-key lifestyle in the United States, that seems to be what is attracting most of them.
I have this conversation with Korean friends often, but they'll regard themselves as representatives of Korea when abroad, and we'll flip that around with Americans and think that we regard ourselves as representatives of America. I'm not sure we think of ourselves in the same way, or they'll say, when I'm traveling, I can't go without kimchi for more than a week. And they'll say, you're American, you'll probably be desperate for a hamburger at some point. None of these things are obviously true of you, right? You obviously know hamburgers. And I don't think you consider yourself to be America embodied the way a Korean would consider themselves to be in America, a real agent of Korea in some sense.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I've lived in so many countries growing up, and Bermuda and the United States and South Africa and Germany, and so I lived on like 3 continents by the time I was about 13. So I wouldn't think of myself as being typically American anyway, but I do find that Koreans are more comfortable with Americans who who behave like Americans.
Which is what? What do you do to behave like an American? Because I don't even know, when somebody asks, what's your favorite American food, I have to really think, what does this person think American food is, you know?
They seem to expect a certain degree of joviality from Americans and yeah, Americans who eat what Americans are supposed to eat. I mean, I'm vegan, and the first thing I get back is, but Americans like meat.
Yeah, that makes no sense as a reply to me.
That's the first thing that I hear. And then, so that's a bit of a problem in the sense that you do get a freedom here, but they don't want the hennagaijin, what the Japanese would call the hennagaijin, the strange foreigner. They don't necessarily want somebody who would be perceived as being strange even in his own country. Yeah.
Can they always tell who would be strange in their own country? I feel like we are already, by being foreigners, sort of strange in Korea. It seems like a lot to ask for a Korean to tell who would be strange even in an American context.
No, I think they pretty much, they're pretty good at it, I think. I think they're right. They're certainly right in thinking me strange, but I've noticed here that there's sort of an expiration period on respectability here, in the sense that it's respectable enough for you to come and spend what the British would call a gap year in Korea teaching English, 1, 2, 3 years. After a while, you can sense that they're not as appreciative of your presence.
If you're still just hanging around teaching English?
Yeah, that even more. But I've noticed also that the longer I get here and the better my Korean gets, the fewer compliments I get on it. There's a level of Korean where they really are appreciative, where they can talk to you without any real problems, and yet there are enormous realms of Korean culture with which you're still unfamiliar. They seem to like that most.
When did you cross that line?
I can't say. I mean, it could have to do with getting older and just sort of aging out of being interesting to Koreans. But I would say since about 4 years ago, and I'm just getting to the stage now where I think, my Korean is not that bad, and the compliments have dried up. So so learn fast.
What's something that you've come to value about, I mean, for lack of a better word, the sort of Korean way, whether it's of doing things or thinking about things, something that's markedly more appreciable to you than in other countries you've lived in?
I would say flexibility, what Koreans call 융통성. It is, it infuriated me a bit at the beginning. I remember driving with a Korean person. The Korean person was driving, and she was trying to find a parking space. And she drove up to this parking space, and the neon sign on the parking space, which was like 3 feet high, said manwon. In other words, full of cars. And she just drove right past that in order to go in. And I said, it says it's full. And she says, there'll be a place. And sure enough, there was a place.
How do they know?
This is it. The Koreans just know. They just have this sixth sense for it. And this flexibility, I have benefited from it so much in my own life, not just in the past that I get from my lousy Korean. But let's just give an example of Germany, which I also love in its own way. In Germany, let's say it's 5:59 and you're heading for the bakery or whatever, and it's due to close at 6. The German will walk right up to that door and close it right in your face. They will lock it on the other side of that glass door with a shrug like, sorry.
6?
Yeah. And a Korean would never do that, ever. And this is what I like about them. And I also have come to appreciate this concept of chung, which I used to chafe at as being this ethnocentric construct, which was just a whole lot of hot air. And chung is this affection that Koreans claim is unique to Korean people. And I think what is truly unique in Korean is what they call miuncheong, which is the affection that you start to feel even for your enemy, even for somebody that's given you nothing but trouble. And I've come to appreciate that and actually to feel that. And I used to take animosities much more seriously between people or between me and other people. When I was in Germany or the United States, I was a much better hater there. Whereas here, I've been in positions where I've had, for example, problem students who've given me nothing but trouble, who've defied me. And we've actually gone at loggerheads for months on end. We've said horrible things to each other. And precisely because of that, this strange affection builds up.
It's a kind of relationship.
It is exactly. It's a kind of relationship. So that after the student graduates and moves on, they're the student I contact the most, and they come by with the bottles of alcohol on Teachers' Day and things like that. And that is something that Koreans know exactly what I'm talking about right away.
Yes.
And I appreciate that. It's a whole new dimension to human life, and it's much healthier for me as well psychologically. Koreans are able to get past things like that. And this is how they were able to move on from the dictatorships without basically tearing their own society apart. It was over, democracy came, and they weren't about to go looking up the torturers and dragging them to trial, because they realized that it wouldn't help them either. Of course, I think it can go too far. I think those dictators got off. I mean, Chun Doo-hwan, I think, got off a little bit too easily. But on the other hand, you can look at societies that never stop digging up things in the past. And I think the Koreans have a lesson for us there as well.
It reminds me of something I see in the relationships with Korean friends and their parents. They're always fighting, yet they're very close. And I want to ask sometimes, do you like your parents or do you hate them? Like in America, we would decide what position we had with regard to our parents and act accordingly. But it's all combined in that one relationship. I mean, is that at all a similar phenomenon?
Yeah, that's true as well. I think it's much rarer in Korea for people not to ever speak to their parents than it is in the West. People will go to their psychologist, their analyst in the West, and they'll realize that they've got toxic parents or whatever the catchy word is. And to Koreans, that would be absolutely unthinkable. And I think this is, again, one of those things where the Koreans are actually too hard on themselves. Koreans perceive themselves as being an extremely temperamental people given to uncontrollable rages and things like that. And that is not at all the experience that I've had here in Korea. In Korea, you will see, for example, somebody parking their car in front of a convenience store with a blissful disregard for the well-being of everybody else. All the other cars have to drive around that car, even putting themselves in harm's way as they make that pass. And yet nobody is freaking out. In the States, you'd have a road rage incident, possibly a deadly one on your hands. Yeah. And these things don't happen. And I also see much less in terms of fisticuffs than I used to see in Korea in the 80s. What violence?
Or just fighting in the 1980s here.
Well, even then it was primarily alcohol fueled. You would be sitting in a pojangmacha, this roadside tent, or you'd be sitting in a bar, and suddenly a table would be overturned because somebody had dropped the polite form of language in the heat of argument or something. Yeah, who are you using low language to? And the table would go flying, and the bottles would go flying, and the manager would be rolling his eyes and calling the cops. I don't see that. And one of the things I don't like about living in America is that there's so much aggression floating around. And it's not just
in the air.
It's just in the air. There's so much macho tension just driving, into town every day. It can happen. And you don't get that here. And yet the Koreans consider themselves to have a temper and anger issue. And I have to tell them we're much worse on that score.
You mentioned your 2001 book, Reader's Manifesto, in which you attacked the pretentiousness of literary prose, which in those days was growing. A listener asked me to ask you again, this was some years ago, but on the 10th anniversary of that book, he said, you've got to ask B.R. Myers, has it improved at all in his mind? What's the situation? Do you have your finger on that pulse at all as far as literary pretentiousness?
I'm nostalgic for that time.
Oh, yeah?
In the sense that at least back then you could still encounter people at a party who were willing to talk to you about books. And I used to think of them as the enemy, the Franson reader or the Don DeLillo reader as being the enemy. And now it's just so tough to find anybody who's still interested in literature. I mean, there are these two sides to me, the literary critic side and the North Korea watcher side. And I am talked about, or I am contacted 10 times more often by the North Korea buffs, but also at a group of, in any kind of gathering, the chance of encountering somebody interested in North Korea, a North Korea buff, is much higher than the chance of encountering somebody who reads literary fiction at all.
One specific country.
Yeah.
All of literary fiction.
Right. It's become almost a niche thing, like being a Star Wars freak or something.
Yeah.
So I now feel a certain sense of solidarity with anybody who likes reading novels, no matter how awful those novels might be, in my opinion. But the literary pretentiousness, I think, is going down, and I think I don't think it's going to be as easy for anybody to sell a lot of books through pretentiousness anymore, primarily because people are reading Kindles, and you cannot see the cover of a book if you're reading it on Kindle. And I think a lot of those copies of White Noise, or even, Franson's Freedom, were sold because people wanted to be seen carrying that book around. They wanted to be seen having it on their office desk.
They were buying the covers.
They were buying the covers. And they can't do that anymore. People just aren't interested. So I just see the general decline, the continued decline of reading. And of course, the average, the 50 Shades of Grey kind of thing. I don't even think we should be discussing that in terms of literature. So I'm just kind of gloomy about it.
As I learn more and more Korean, I'm able to read more and more books in Korean. And I wonder, what's been your experience with South Korean literature? Is it something you read? Is it something you feel like you can evaluate the pretentiousness or lack thereof of?
I have to be honest and say that I don't particularly like South Korean literature, and I don't particularly like Korean prose, long form Korean prose fiction.
What is it like? Because I'm not good enough to read a whole novel yet, so I just wonder, purely out of curiosity, what is it like? What's wrong with it, in your opinion?
I don't think it's. I would have to say that they have macro structural problems, and these are what I perceive in Korean films as well, South Korean films as well, which I have to say tend to get too much of a bonus for Koreanness. I mean, if you look at Rotten Tomatoes, it's like every Korean movie has over 80% tomato meter. What is that? My perception is that, my feeling is that these movies all start out good. You've always got a great first half hour, and then you watch it fall apart. And this is my experience with Korean novels as well. I like Hwang Sun-won, who's a Korean novelist of the old days, but I think I like him because he writes many ways like a Japanese novelist, and I have to say I like Japanese fiction more than South Korean fiction. The reason I find it not so interesting is because this is a collectivist and conformist society, and without knowing that, you can't understand North Korea either. And just as I don't like watching Hong Sang-soo movies. I say this knowing that you've written about him.
Yeah. That's partially why I like him, though, is because he also makes people hate him. You know what I mean? If everybody liked his movies, I don't think I would like them.
I just don't particularly enjoy movies about people in which people are sitting around drinking soju, saying things that you hear when I approach a novel, I expect to be brought into contact with somebody special in some way. And I find that Koreans tend to enjoy fictional and cinematic depictions of normal, everyday group life.
They want to see a mirror.
They want to see a mirror, and they will sit back and nod at that. And I just have to say, it doesn't do very much for me. Although, since we brought up Hong Sang-soo, I should bring up one of the highlights of my time in Busan, which was meeting Isabelle Huppert on the street. I've been carrying a torch for her since The Lace Maker, which is like the late 70s. She's always been sort of my ideal actress and ideal woman. And I was in the film festival. I was invited to the German party at the film festival, and I got there too early, so I was just sort of loitering on a street corner. And who should come out of the convenience store carrying a little plastic bag but Isabelle Huppert, without an ounce of makeup, looking fantastic. This is like 2011, and she was gracious enough to let me walk her to the front door of her hotel. So I like that part of the Hong Sang-soo film. Anything with her in it is fine by me. But the films and the books, And this, of course, is going to put a damper on your ability to learn Korean well. And if you do like movies, then you're going to be in a good position. If you watch them with Korean subtitles over and over again, you're going to really make an enormous step forward in your Korean skills.
Can we chalk some of this up to the parts of Korea you don't find interesting? Can we chalk it up to the fact that the individual hasn't really arrived in Korea yet?
I don't want to say hasn't arrived, because that implies that collectivism and conformism is somehow more backward than individualism. And I'm finally in my old age now, I've become mature enough to realize that there's an awful lot to be said for the way that they live life as well. And this is why Americans, when I say to Americans, Koreans are very collective, the Americans will immediately bristle and say, how can you say such a horrible thing? How can you make such a ghastly generalization?
Think of a beehive or something.
Yeah, because they think it's a bad thing. And when I say to Koreans, you guys seem to be very collective, they will nod and grin and consider that to be actually a strong point of their society, their ability to get along with each other and their cultural and ethnic homogeneity. They perceive those things as strengths. Right. And the North Koreans, of course, all the more so. And I'm not saying that they're not strengths, and I'm not saying that their way of life is less valuable or less intellectually noble than being a loner at all. But it's just an enormous difference. And I do think that a novel written from a collectivist perspective is not going to be as interesting as a novel. I mean, even John Dos Passos, for example, to take an example of a novel that's filled with characters, they're all individuals in those characters, even if they're standing for a certain class or a certain occupation. They're very much individuals, and I don't get that sense when I'm reading Korean novels, and I don't ever hear people saying, you're like that person in the novel. Like we would say he's just like, this Dickens character. He's like Scrooge or whatever.
Right. If you say it in Korea, it's of course they're like a character in a novel, because that's why that's what a character is. It's a reflection. Exactly.
Yeah. It's like a reflection. Yeah. And the dialogue as well. I don't hear any American who's seen any movies has this whole cache of memorable quotes, and they don't come away either from fiction or from movies with those memorable quotes.
Finally, do you see more differences or similarities emerging between the North and the South in recent years?
In terms of economy, of course, there's a North Korea is looking more and more like a poor man's version of South Korea. You've got a very rough and tumble version of the kind of capitalism that they had here 30 or 40 years ago. That's becoming more similar. And I'm sure they're learning more and more about South Korean culture. They're all, watching these South Korean dramas. I noticed I had a North Korean refugee or migrant speak to my students a few weeks ago. And this was a young man who escaped from North Korea about a year and a half ago. And I noticed less of a cultural divide than I noticed from North Korean migrants when I first came here. So I think they are becoming more similar in that way. Of course, similar in the sense of the North Koreans approaching South Koreanness. The unfortunate thing, of course, is that the South Koreans are not going to ever absorb the good things that the North Koreans have to offer in their lifestyle. I do like the pride in Koreanness that Koreans have. I like the fact that they do not feel it necessary to use an English word when there's a perfectly good Korean word already. And I heard from this migrant that they still, as cutthroat as the society up there has become in comparison to how it used to be, they still share food. They still share things. They still think of themselves as they think of their apartment building as being a community. And unfortunately, I think those things are going to go by the wayside as soon as unification comes about.
I've been speaking here in Busan, South Korea with Brian Reynolds Myers. He is a North Korea analyst, author of The Cleanest Race. Of course, we also discussed a Reader's Manifesto. You can still buy it. If you haven't read it, do read it, especially if you still care about novels. Brian, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Colin.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to all the backers of Notebook on Cities and Culture's Korea tour on Kickstarter. Adam Hartzell, Aidan Nullman, Alfred Lee, Andy Cooney, Angus Gordon, Bala Chinupati, Cam Smith, Chin Music Press, Dan Caraselli, Danny, Deborah Smith, Emmett Farragher, Humberto Grant, Ian Plosker, Ismail Kennedy, Jackie Gast, Jay Chang, Jeffrey Davis, James DeVito, Jonathan Filbert, Josh Paget, Kimberly Hahn, Manveer, Mark Hines, Matthew Workman, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Monica Eck, Michael Fransky, MJ Pritchett, Patrick O'Flaherty, Patrick Park, Piers Rippey, Robert Salzberg, Samuel Hansen, Sean Brown, Themistocles Crucis, Thomas Unterberger, Timothy Dobbs, and Wayne Wright.